My name is Elaine Foster. I turned 64 last winter, and if you'd asked anyone in town about me back then, they'd have told you I was steady, dependable, predictable. It's funny how a word like predictable can be a compliment in some mouths and a weapon in others. In his mouth, in Henry's mouth, it was always a weapon. "You're so predictable, Elaine," he'd say with that crooked smile, like he'd just uncovered some private flaw of mine that no one else could see. And for most of my life with him, I let him be right. I wore the same muted sweaters he preferred, baked the same Sunday pies, kept the same circle of friends, the ones he approved of. I told myself it was compromise, that all marriages were built on it. But compromise implies two people meeting in the middle. We never did. I just kept moving closer to his side until my own disappeared. Henry didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing a temper. No, his cruelty was the quiet kind, the raised eyebrow when I ordered dessert, the "Are you sure?" when I picked out a dress, the way he'd correct me in conversation so gently others thought he was helping. He called it keeping things on track. I called it survival, quiet survival. By my 50s, the little rebellions I'd once allowed myself, a solo afternoon at the lake, a blouse he hadn't chosen, had all but vanished. He had a way of making even my pleasures feel like mistakes. We never had much money, at least not the kind you could see. Henry worked as a land surveyor, careful with every dollar, but always finding a reason why there wasn't enough for the things I wanted. Somehow there was enough for his fishing gear, his rare bourbon collection, his networking weekends. But a new set of paints for me? Maybe next year. I let the years slide past like that. Birthdays, anniversaries, summers that smelled of cut grass, and winters of wood smoke, all of them measured against his moods. And then came my 60th birthday. He didn't forget. Henry never forgot dates. But instead of a gift, he gave me a speech. Over dinner at our kitchen table, he leaned back in his chair and told me, almost like a joke, "I'm glad you've stayed the same all these years. I always know what you're going to do. You're reliable, predictable." Something in me tightened. Not because it was new, I'd heard the word before, but because that night I finally understood what he meant. It wasn't a compliment. It was ownership. In his mind, I was as fixed and unchanging as the furniture. He went to bed satisfied, certain he'd spoken some great truth. I stayed at the table long after the lights were out, staring at my half-empty wine glass, thinking, what would happen if I proved him wrong? At first, it was just a thought experiment, a game I played in my head while folding laundry or raking leaves. But thoughts have a way of sharpening once you give them space. I started small. I changed my walking route in the mornings without telling him. I wore the green scarf he always said clashed with my hair. I baked a lemon tart on a Tuesday, no reason, no occasion. When Henry noticed, he just laughed. "Look at you," he said, trying new things. He thought it was cute, temporary. I let him think that. Then I began keeping a notebook. Nothing fancy, a lined spiral one I bought with the groceries. In it, I wrote the things I'd stopped saying aloud, what I'd do with a week alone, how I'd spend money if I didn't have to account for every cent, what it would feel like to sit in my own kitchen without waiting for him to approve of something. Some entries were only a sentence or two, others went on for pages. And the more I wrote, the more I saw the pattern, the way I'd been trained to edit myself before a word even left my mouth. It was the first time in decades I'd kept something that was mine alone. That privacy felt dangerous in the best way. By autumn, my changes had gone underground. I started reading in the evenings instead of watching his shows. I stayed out a little later on my errands, visiting the small coffee shop on the edge of town where no one knew me. The young woman behind the counter once asked if I was a writer. I told her not yet, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't lying. I didn't know it then, but the moment Henry called me predictable on my birthday was the last day he was right about me. The rest, the proof he'd been wrong all along, was still to come. And I was going to make sure he never saw it coming. The next shift came one Saturday in November. Henry had gone off on one of his fishing weekends, the kind that always seemed to come with more hotel receipts than trout. I'd long stopped asking about them. The answers were predictable, which I suppose was the point. That Saturday morning, I was dusting the shelves in the den when I came across an old wooden box tucked behind the photo albums. I'd seen it before, Henry's keepsake box, he called it, but I'd never opened it. Predictable wives don't pry. Except that day, I did. Inside were slips of paper, a few coins, and an envelope of photographs. The coins were foreign, from places Henry had never mentioned visiting. The slips were receipts, dinners, jewelry, hotel stays in cities he'd never taken me to. And the photos, not scandalous, not quite, but close enough. Smiling with women I didn't know, arms around waists, faces too intimate for strangers. I didn't cry. I didn't slam the lid shut. I just sat there, the dust rag in my hand, feeling the slow, steady click of pieces falling into place. The receipts went back in the box. So did the photos. I closed it and returned it to its spot on the shelf, exactly as I'd found it. Because I realized something then. If I ever wanted to change my life, I couldn't do it on emotion. Emotion was noisy. It tipped people off. And I wanted silence. I wanted precision. That night, I started a second notebook. This one wasn't for feelings. It was for facts, dates, times, expenses, where he said he'd be versus where he actually was. I could tell from the receipts, the credit card statements, the mileage on his truck. It was tedious, careful work, and it felt more satisfying than I'd imagined. Henry came home Sunday evening smelling of lake water and cheap cologne. He asked if I'd missed him. I smiled and said, of course. I don't think he noticed the way my eyes lingered a moment too long. I was already learning his tells. By winter, I'd found my own kind of freedom in small, stolen spaces. The library became my second home, not just for books, but for the quiet, the kind of quiet you can think in. There's a corner table near the back, half hidden by the stacks, where I'd sit with my notebooks and my coffee from the shop down the street. I'd map out the week's expenses, then cross-check them against Henry's stories. A pattern was forming, and patterns have power. Around Christmas, he gave me a necklace. Gold, tasteful, the kind of thing he knew I'd wear because it matched everything I owned. I thanked him, kissed his cheek, and later tucked the receipt into my fax notebook. Bought in mid-December, the same weekend he'd told me he was helping a friend move. I didn't confront him, not because I believed his lies, but because I finally understood the rule that would guide me from here on. Confrontation is for people who want change. I didn't want change. I wanted control. And control comes from knowing more than the other person thinks you do. January was when I began the money work. Nothing bold, nothing noticeable. If he gave me $40 for groceries, I'd spend $34 and put the rest in a tea tin on the top shelf of the pantry. Found a 10 in his coat pocket while doing laundry, into the tin. The first deposit into my own hands felt like a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was there. By February, I'd opened a small savings account at a bank 2 towns over, one Henry had no reason to visit. I used my maiden name. The deposits were small, irregular, but steady. It was a seed, and I knew seeds grow best where they're left alone. Meanwhile, I kept giving him the little victories he thrived on, letting him correct me on a detail I knew was right, asking for his opinion on a recipe I'd already decided to make, laughing at his recycled jokes at dinner parties. He never suspected that every laugh, every nod, was another brick in the wall I was building between us. The turn came one night in March. We were at the home of one of his friends, a man who owned half the properties on the east side of town. Midway through dinner, Henry launched into a story about how he'd convinced me not to buy a car a few years back. She didn't need it, he told them. Would have been a waste of money. They all chuckled, and I smiled along, but inside, something shifted. It wasn't just that he'd denied me the freedom to come and go without asking. It was that he'd told the story as if I'd been the child, and he the wise parent. That night, in my notebook, I wrote, "This is not my final chapter." By spring, I was done thinking in terms of escape. Escape is a burst of speed, risky, desperate. I wasn't desperate anymore. I was deliberate. I started storing a few personal items at the home of a woman I'd met at the library, Lydia, a widow who ran a small antique shop in town. She didn't ask many questions, and I didn't give many answers. A box of photo albums here, a set of dishes there. Nothing Henry would miss right away. Every time I moved something, I felt a little lighter, a little less predictable. Henry didn't notice. He thought my predictability was part of the air he breathed, too constant to change. And that, I realized, was his blind spot. Because while he was busy counting on me to stay the same, I was quietly becoming someone he wouldn't recognize at all. By May, I knew Henry's schedule better than he did. Mondays were early starts at the county office. Wednesdays, he lingered late at the VFW hall. Fridays, he stayed to finish reports, which always meant I'd find the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on his jacket the next morning. He believed this pattern was proof of his reliability. For me, it was a roadmap, and I'd been tracing it for months. I began timing my errands to the moments when I knew he was distracted elsewhere. Tuesday afternoons, I'd drive to Lydia's antique shop and add to my growing stash the quilt my mother made, the sewing kit my grandmother passed down, the blue china teacups Henry always said were too delicate to use. Each item was a thread in the fabric of my new life, and I was folding it away piece by piece. The trick was to balance absence with presence. Too much time away and Henry would sniff out the change. Too much attention at home and I'd lose my momentum. So I made sure to keep feeding him those little moments he craved. The nods, the smiles, the "oh, you're right, dear" lines that kept his ego purring. He mistook my compliance for devotion. That suited me fine. In June, I took a part-time bookkeeping job at a small greenhouse just outside town. The owner, a quiet man named Richard, paid in cash and didn't mind that I only worked 8 hours a week. Henry thought I was volunteering at the library, keeping my mind busy. He liked the idea. It sounded wholesome, safe, predictable. The cash went straight to my account in the next town. The paper trail stayed clean. The deposits were small enough to look like nothing. But nothing adds up if you give it time. I also began making copies of important documents, our tax returns, insurance policies, property deeds. Anything with both our names on it went into a brown envelope I kept tucked inside a hollowed-out cookbook on the top kitchen shelf. Henry never cooked. In his mind, the kitchen was my territory, just as the checkbook was his. That blind trust in our roles was his second blind spot. I was learning how to turn both of them into weapons. One humid afternoon in late July, we were invited to a barbecue at the home of one of Henry's fishing buddies. The men gathered in the yard, beers in hand, talking about boats and bait. I sat with the wives on the patio, smiling when expected, answering questions politely. At one point, Henry wandered over, slid his arm around my shoulders, and said to the group, "I got lucky with this one. She keeps everything in order, never surprises me." They laughed. He laughed. I laughed too, though for an entirely different reason. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't just preparing to leave him. I was preparing to outplay him. And the best part was, he'd never suspect it until the board was cleared. By August, the pieces were falling into place. My belongings were slowly disappearing into Lydia's storage room. My savings account had grown enough to pay 6 months' rent, somewhere modest. The brown envelope of documents was thick, orderly, ready. I'd even chosen my Exit date, November 9th. Just after Henry's annual deer hunting trip, when he'd be flush with stories and too distracted to notice the quiet shift happening under his feet. All I needed now was patience. One evening in September, Henry came home earlier than usual. I was at the kitchen table, sorting the week's mail. He noticed a letter from the bank and reached for it without asking. My hand got there first. "I'll take care of it," I said lightly. His eyes lingered on mine for just a beat too long. Then he smiled, that patronizing curve of the mouth that said he'd let me win this one. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "You think I'm playing your game. I'm building my own." In October, I gave him one of the biggest false victories yet. We'd been talking about replacing the washer for months, and Henry had been dragging his feet. One Saturday, I suggested we go look at models. He sighed, pretended to think it over, and finally agreed, on the condition that we choose something practical. We bought the one he picked. I praised his good sense all the way home. He was so pleased with himself that he didn't notice the small package I'd slipped into the trunk at the appliance store, a set of sturdy, lockable storage boxes. They went straight to Lydia's the following week. The last turn before the final stretch came 2 weeks later. We were sitting in the living room after dinner. He was flipping through channels, complaining about the news, when he turned to me and said, "You know, Elaine, I think we've got the kind of marriage people envy. Steady, comfortable, no drama." I smiled at him. "I'm glad you think so." Inside, I was already standing in the doorway of a place he didn't know existed, holding the keys to a life he couldn't imagine. November came in cold and sharp, the kind of wind that makes the last leaves rattle against the windows. I'd been counting down to this month since August, my days moving in 2 parallel lines, the one Henry could see and the one I kept hidden. To him, everything looked ordinary. I made his coffee at 6:15 every morning, set out the paper, asked about his day. We still went to the same diner on Thursdays, still sat in the same pew at church on Sundays. I even made his favorite pot roast one Saturday, the one he bragged about to his friends. Predictability, the very thing he used to define me, had become my camouflage. But under that still surface, I was busy. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, when he was buried in county records or lingering at the VFW, I drove to Lydia's shop. We'd carry another box up to her storage room, tucked between stacks of old lamps and chairs no one wanted. The sight of my life packed away in cardboard should have made me sad. Instead, it steadied me. It reminded me that my life didn't have to be a stage where Henry was the only actor getting lines. The week before my chosen date, November 9th, I staged a final series of normal events to keep him distracted. On Monday, I accidentally burned the chicken and suggested takeout from his favorite barbecue place. On Wednesday, I let him teach me how to use the new washer again, even though I'd read the manual cover to cover. On Friday, I asked his advice about the best route to the grocery store because I thought the road construction might make me late. Each little question made him lean back in his chair like a king on his throne. He thought I was reaffirming his place in the hierarchy. In truth, I was softening the ground beneath his feet. On the morning of November 8th, Henry left for work unusually cheerful. "One more day and I'm out in the woods," he said, meaning his annual deer trip with the same group of men who'd taught him that wives were accessories. I wished him luck, kissed his cheek, and watched from the window as his truck disappeared down the street. Then I turned and looked around the kitchen. The spotless counters, the empty sink, the polished wood table, and thought, one more day and I'm free. That afternoon, I drove to the bank 2 towns over. The teller, a young man who always wore bright socks under his dark slacks, didn't ask questions when I withdrew just under the reporting limit from my savings account. Cash, easy to carry, easy to hide. It went into the brown envelope with the documents, which I slid into the lockable storage box now waiting at Lydia's. I also stopped by the greenhouse. Richard handed me my pay in an envelope as usual. "You going anywhere nice for the holidays?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, and smiled. Not a lie, just a timeline he couldn't see. That night, Henry was in a restless mood. He double-checked his gear, called his buddy twice, and complained about the forecast. At one point, he turned to me and said, "You're not going to get bored without me, are you?" I gave him my best practiced smile. "You know me, predictable as ever." He laughed, satisfied, and went back to his packing. If he'd looked a little closer, he might have noticed my eyes didn't match my voice. But men like Henry don't look for that kind of detail. They only look for confirmation that the world is still arranged in their favor. November 9th arrived gray and brittle, frost clinging to the edges of the lawn. Henry was up before dawn, clattering in the kitchen, making too much noise with his coffee pot. I lay in bed listening to him move through the house, every step a countdown. At 5:15, he kissed my forehead. "See you Sunday night," he said. I murmured something about staying safe, about bringing home something for the freezer, and then he was gone. I waited until I heard the rumble of his truck fade completely before I got up. There was no rush. I had the whole day, and more importantly, I had the quiet. I moved methodically, clothes into one suitcase, my notebooks, both the feelings and the facts, into a tote bag. The tea tin, my grandmother's sewing kit, a few framed photos I couldn't part with. Everything else was already at Lydia's. By mid-morning, the house looked exactly as it had when he left, except for the absence of me. I locked the door behind me for the last time. The sound of the bolt sliding into place felt final, like the period at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for years. At Lydia's, we loaded my things into her van. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" she asked. "I'm sure," I said. "It's better this way." She didn't press. Lydia understood the value of quiet exits. We drove to the apartment I'd signed for under my maiden name. 2nd floor, small balcony, view of the alley behind a bakery. The place smelled faintly of yeast and coffee, not the lake water and cologne I'd lived with for decades. The carpet was worn, the paint uneven, but it was mine. By early afternoon, my boxes were stacked neatly against one wall. Lydia hugged me and left. I sat on the floor, sipping tea from the blue china cup Henry had never let me use, and listened to the hum of my new refrigerator. No footsteps overhead, no voice in the next room telling me what I should or shouldn't be doing. At 4 p.m., I took the final step in my plan. I left the brown envelope of documents at a lawyer's office in town, along with a letter explaining exactly how our assets had been acquired and why I was entitled to my share. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, promised to file the necessary motions by Monday. Before I left, she asked, "Do you want him to know yet?" "Not yet," I said. "Let him think he's already won." That evening, I wrote in my notebook for hours. I didn't write about fear or doubt. Those belonged to the woman I used to be. I wrote about the smell of the bakery downstairs, the way the setting sun made the wall opposite my window glow faintly gold, the silence that didn't need to be negotiated. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized that for the first time in 40 years, I could breathe without measuring the space I was taking. And I also realized something else. My plan wasn't about revenge anymore, not entirely. It was about proof. Proof that I'd been right to imagine a life outside his shadow. Proof that predictable was just the name he gave to the version of me he could control. Henry wouldn't discover I was gone until late Sunday night. By then, the keys would be on the kitchen counter, the note in plain view. "Don't call me. You won't like what you find if you do." He would think it was a bluff. He would think he could pull me back the way you reel in a fish. And that would be the last mistake he ever made about me. Henry came back from his deer trip late Sunday night, as planned. By then, I was already asleep in my new bed, the hum of the bakery's ovens below me like a lullaby. I can picture the exact sequence of his discovery. He would have carried his gear through the front door, dropped his boots in the mudroom, called out my name into the dark. When silence answered, he'd check the bedroom, then the closets, the kitchen, and finally, he'd see the keys on the counter next to my note. I'd bet he read it twice, once in disbelief and once in the brittle tone of a man calculating how to make the writer regret every word. I didn't hear from him the next morning or the next. That told me everything about his state of mind. He thought he could wait me out. In his head, I was a storm, loud, messy, temporary. He was the steady one, the rock I'd eventually crash back into. On the third day, the first call came. He didn't ask where I was. Men like Henry never give the other person the satisfaction of thinking they have something you want. Instead, he said, "We need to talk." His voice was clipped, controlled. "This is a misunderstanding." I didn't call back. 2 days later, the tone shifted. A voicemail. "Some of our accounts aren't working. I assume you've made a mistake moving things around. Call me, and we can straighten it out." The only mistake was his assumption. Long before I'd left, I'd met with the lawyer and the bank to ensure my rights were protected. Joint accounts were frozen pending division. Assets in my name were secured. Even his retirement fund, the one he liked to remind me wasn't my concern, was now partly my concern thanks to the law. The second week brought the first real crack in his control. He showed up at Lydia's shop. I was in the back room helping her unpack a shipment when I heard the bell over the front door. His voice carried, smooth, polite, asking after me. Lydia, bless her, played it perfectly. "She doesn't work here," she said. "Haven't seen her in a while." I stood in the shadows between shelves of old dishes, listening to the pause that followed. That pause told me he'd guessed I was there, but he didn't push it, not yet. He left, and the sound of his truck pulling away was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in years. By late November, the calls turned into letters. Neatly typed, always folded just so. The first ones were laced with stability and partnership, his favorite euphemisms for control. The later ones carried the sting of warning, veiled reminders of what I'd owe if I didn't cooperate. I kept every letter. I also sent copies of certain journal entries and key receipts to my lawyer. They weren't accusations. They were a record, and records have a way of becoming weapons if someone forces your hand. The first real turn came when he tried to use the town against me. I began hearing from old acquaintances, the ones Henry had always made sure I saw only at his side. "He says he's worried about you," one told me. "He said you've been unwell," said another. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I just listened, thanked them, and walked away. If Henry wanted to build a story, I'd let him. The higher the scaffolding, the harder the fall when the truth came out. December brought snow, and the first proof that my silence was more unnerving to him than any confrontation could be. He cornered me at the grocery store. I was in the baking aisle comparing bags of flour when I felt him step in beside me. "You look well," he said. "I am," I replied. He searched my face, looking for some sign of hesitation. I gave him nothing. "Is this really how you want it?" he asked. I tilted my head, as if considering the question. "No, Henry, this is how it already is." For a moment, his jaw tightened. That barely visible tell I'd learned to spot decades ago. Then he stepped back, smiled thinly, and walked away. The rest of December passed in small, deliberate moves. I met with the lawyer twice more. We began the process of formally dividing property. Every step was methodical, documented, irreversible. Meanwhile, I sent one last package to a person Henry would never suspect, his former business partner. Inside, copies of receipts, notes from my journal, and a letter explaining why I'd left. No accusations, just facts. Facts that would raise questions in the right circles. Not because I needed revenge in the public sense, but because I wanted to make sure that by the time Henry realized the game was over, his version of events would already be slipping from his grip. By New Year's Eve, I could feel the final stretch approaching. The accounts were nearly settled. My apartment felt lived in. The smell of bread from the bakery downstairs was no longer new. It was home. Henry still thought there was a door back into my life. He didn't know that the hinges had been melted off long before he ever thought to knock, and I was content to let him stand there in the cold, believing he had time. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday in mid-February. Snow was melting in dirty piles at the corners of the streets. The bakery below my apartment had switched from cinnamon rolls to hot cross buns, and I'd begun to forget what it felt like to measure my mood against someone else's. The papers were plain clinical: property division, account transfers, retirement allocation. Nothing in them spoke of decades of control, of the quiet war I'd waged in my own home. They were just numbers and signatures. But I knew better. Every line was a piece of ground I'd reclaimed. Henry got the house, the truck, the trophies on the wall. I got my freedom, half the assets, and the knowledge that he'd never seen it coming. 2 weeks after the settlement, I received the first real sign that he understood. Not fully. Henry never did anything fully, but enough to see the outline. It was a letter. No neat phrases about stability this time, no veiled offers to move past it. Just a single line, typed in the center of the page. You made your point. I read it twice. The first time, I felt the satisfaction I'd been building toward for over a year. The second time, I saw something better. The admission he didn't know what my point had really been. Because in his mind, the point was about leaving, about money, about proving I could survive without him. He still didn't realize that leaving was just the first move. The real point was that for the first time since I was 21, I'd lived a year without bending myself into the shape he preferred. And he couldn't touch that. In early March, I ran into him again, pure accident. I was coming out of the hardware store with a small potted rosemary plant for my windowsill. He was getting out of his truck, a paper sack of takeout in one hand. For a moment, we just looked at each other. He seemed smaller, like the air around him had thinned. There was no bluster in his face, no smug half-smile. Just a man who'd lost something he thought he owned and was still trying to name it. "How have you been?" he asked finally. "Well," I said, and I meant it. He nodded slowly. "You got what you wanted then?" I let the silence stretch between us until it was just a little uncomfortable. Then I smiled, not cruelly, not warmly, just the kind of smile that says we're not on the same map anymore. "No, Henry," I said. "I got what you never even thought to give me, and you can't get it back." I watched the words land, not with a crash, but with that slow, sinking realization that comes when a person finally understands they've been playing the wrong game. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. I walked away first. The rosemary plant was warm in my hands. From the sun, the scent sharp and clean. I could feel his eyes on my back, and for the first time in decades, I didn't care what he saw. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea. The chipped blue china cup that had made the whole trip from Lydia's storage to this apartment. I opened my first notebook, the one I'd bought when all this was still just a thought. I flipped through the pages, past the cramped early entries full of questions I was afraid to answer, past the careful lists of receipts and patterns, to the final blank sheet. I picked up my pen and wrote, "He called me predictable. I proved him wrong." Then I closed the notebook and slid it into the drawer. Not as a trophy. Trophies are for people still trying to win. This was different. This was a record.